Hello and welcome to today's inaugural panel on the inauguration of Joe Biden as 46th President of the United States and the celebration of Kamala Harris as Vice President of the United States of America. I'm Graeme Boushey. I'm the director of the Jack W. Peltason Center for the Study of Democracy, and on behalf of Louis DeSipio, panelist today and chair of the Department of Political Science, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this discussion of today's inauguration. We'll have the opportunity in the short term to reflect on the inauguration itself, a remarkable event, 4 years, with the stakes heightened this year, that celebrates the transition of power in American politics. We'll remark on how this inauguration was similar and departed from inaugurations of the past. We'll also have a chance, both in our discussions and in the questions you may ask to our panelists, to reflect on the challenges and opportunities for a Biden administration moving forward, and to reflect on the successes and failures of the prior 4 years under the Trump administration and his departure today, leaving as 45th President of the United States of America. Today, we're going to be joined by three panelists who are members of the Department of Political Science. We'll begin with Professor Louis DeSipio, chair of the Department of Political Science and a faculty member in the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies here at UC Irvine. Professor DeSipio, in addition to being a political scientist, as are all of our panelists, a child of Washington, D.C., whose family worked in prior administrations. Will be followed by Carole Uhlaner, also a member of the Department of Political Science, who, in addition to offering a perspective on American politics and her experience of watching inaugurations past, can give us a comparative perspective of transitions of power in other democracies. Finally, we'll be joined by Professor Marty Wattenberg, professor of political science, expert on voting behavior, voting, and presidential politics, who similarly has a long family history of observing inaugurations. So for all of our panelists today, we'll remark on not only our reactions to the inauguration as political scientists, but also as longtime observers of this celebration of American democracy. With that in mind, I want to turn it over to Professor DeSipio, simply to say that I found today quite a remarkable moment, in the sense that in many ways the pantomime of the inauguration seemed familiar, and in many ways that was comforting but also remarkable, given the contestation over the election leading to the Capitol insurrection or riots on January 6th. It stands to reason that in addition to being a celebration of American democracy, it is also a moment to pause and reflect on the enormous challenges that face the Biden administration and indeed the majority and minority leadership of Democrats and Republicans in our legislative branch to figure out how to steer this country forward over the next 4 years in a period as divisive as has been in my lifetime. So with those comments in mind, I will turn it over to Professor DeSipio and say to our panelists that should you have a question, you can note them in the question and answer. And many times we will answer them in the question and answer in real time. In other moments, we will save them and talk about them collectively. So please ask your questions as they come to you. Professor DeSipio.
Thank you very much, Professor Boushey, and thank you for working with the department to organize this event. It's something that we've proudly done for a number of inaugurations now, and I'm pleased that we continue that tradition today. I think that notion of tradition is a lot of what we saw in the inauguration. You had the soaring rhetoric and sort of anodyne reality of a transition of power. Where we had taken that for granted to some degree in the past, or political scientists had said, isn't it wonderful that we're doing this? I think we take it particularly not for granted this year. We are very pleased that over, considering the events of the last couple of weeks and couple of months, that we had what seemed like a relatively normal ceremony today. I should caution, though, that relatively normal ceremony required 25,000 National Guard troops, many of whom you saw if you were watching the video feed from Washington. It was also in the reality of a global pandemic, which required, at a minimum, everybody on the dais and everybody in the audience to be wearing face masks, but the reality of sort of that fear that pervades the nation. I thought President Biden hit the exact right grace notes in this sort of an event. And I would begin that not with his comments this morning, but the event last night at the Lincoln Memorial, where for the first time, a leader of the United States in a formal role has recognized the deaths that are pervading the nation, 400,000 now. A very quiet, a very eloquent moment that I think reflected the change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. Certainly, there were relatively few policy specifics in today's inaugural address, but in a way, it was sort of the anti-Carnage message, sort of a counter to what was said 4 years ago in a similar event. Now, that's not to say that President Biden was neglecting the challenges that he faces. He recognized white supremacy, he recognized COVID, he recognized the insurrection of a couple of weeks ago, even leading the conversation with that. These are not sort of the normal sort of framing notes for an inaugural address, but then in the content of the address, he committed himself, his administration, and the country to meet its highest ideals. And that is really what a transition of power is all about. Certainly the unstated counter to that was not present. The absence of former President Trump was, I think, a stark note and a sad end to an administration that fought for division rather than unity. President Biden made clear that his goal as president is unity. As I say, the message was light on policy specifics. Certainly there were hints at promise towards the environment, and hints at promise towards bipartisanship, actually more than hints there, quite commitment there. But to the degree that President Biden in his past life could sometimes be long-winded, he was not in his speech today. It was a relatively tight address and showed the nation who he is, and I think who he has been through most of his professional career. That raises the question, though, of whether a speech like this and an event as anodyne but engaging as this, I think, will speak to the 70% of the Republican base who thinks that Biden's election was illegitimate. The answer in a day is probably no. It'll be interesting to actually see how many were watching today's event. I would suspect a lower viewerage than the average inaugural. But the challenge that the Biden presidency, that President Biden himself and that the Biden administration faces is to achieve what he committed himself to today, which was unity and truth. And those are evasive values in Washington today. He certainly got himself off to a good start today, but the real work is ahead, as it always is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor DeSipio. Next, we'll be joined by Professor Carole Uhlaner.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Graeme, for inviting me to be part of this. As Graeme indicated in his intro, actually all three panelists today grew up as children of civil servants either in Washington or in the suburbs. So we were accustomed to the inauguration being a celebratory event that the whole community could be part of in one way or the other. And I know my fellow panelists have some actually good anecdotes on that. So one of the first and striking things about today, which Graeme and Louis have already alluded to, is that there were troops all over the Capitol. There were, in the video coverage, they didn't appear that often, but the fact that the mall was filled with flags, not people, and that there were huge chain link fences around and people couldn't get from one part of the city to the other is something different. Thankfully, actually, when we were planning this, we were concerned that we might have more to talk about with regard to that. Thankfully not. This went off peacefully. So I want to make a brief comment about not all inaugurations have been peaceful, or they've all been peaceful, but there have been other inaugurations that have been unusual. 1861, there were fears for Abraham Lincoln's safety, and there were sharpshooters set up on the roofs all along his route to the Capitol. and he was accompanied by a military escort because of those concerns. Protests have been at previous inaugurations. In 2017, 4 years ago, there were thousands of protesters. They didn't make it as far as the Capitol. They got stopped at various security checkpoints along the way. In 2005, second inaugural of George W. Bush, there were also substantial protests in the street. But this was different. And before I talk more about this, the comparative reference I want to make, Graeme, is not so much to transition to power, but what this called to mind for me was October 1970 in Canada, where in response to a domestic, well, the government referred to it as a domestic threat as terrorism. There were troops and tanks on Parliament Hill. And I can say more about that later. It wasn't as part of transition to power. It was in response to the Front for the Liberation of Quebec kidnapping a British diplomat and a Quebec cabinet member. But the point about that was that it created shock in Canada, real shock, to the point of the Prime Minister being berated by CBC reporters. And maybe it's a statement of our times that this is not as shocking as it might be otherwise. So the second major point I want to make is about the ways in which this transition is unusual. There's special challenges that the Biden administration has faced. The first special challenge is the very limited cooperation from the outgoing administration, with active obstruction on the part of the outgoing president. We don't know exactly to what degree members of the administration lower down have been able to cooperate, but clearly not at the usual level. The second thing that makes this transition very unusual is that this is happening at the time of a pandemic. The new people onboarding are going to have some restrictions on how much in-person interaction they can have and with how many people and with what ways. It's all going to make it more difficult. Now, the implication of both those first and second points is that, in my view, it's extremely advantageous that Biden has taken the approach of selecting people to fill the administration, both at cabinet level and well down, who have been there before. They know where the conference rooms are. And even if they don't get full access to what's happened in the last 4 years, I hope they do. They know what was there 4 years ago, right? And they know where to look. So I think under the circumstances, it's extremely positive for the nation and for government that we have people coming in who have been there. As Lewis mentioned, he went through we faced challenges, which President Biden went through in some detail. Oh, let me add to that also that the civil service itself has been hollowed out in the last 4 years, and it's a high priority to get people in there. I'd like to, one of my colleagues suggested I specifically mention that rebuilding the IRS is high priority. That would make a big difference on the revenue side. And the final really unusual aspect of this transition is there's an impeachment trial coming in the Senate, which is going to complicate both confirming the practical matter of time in the Senate, time for confirmations, and the political fallout is something that we have to think about. The third and final, but perhaps lengthiest point I want to make is with regard to the public opinion challenge that's facing President Biden. As Lewis has said, we have something like 2/3 of Republicans as of yesterday or day before poll still think that Trump won the election, right? And that this was a steal. Something like half of Republicans think Trump doesn't have in response to pollsters, I don't know in their heart of hearts, think Trump has no responsibility for January 6th. And over 1/3 of the total population approve of the job that President Trump has done. In that context, there's a large public opinion challenge. And I think that is very much what President Biden attempted to address in his inaugural speech today. How do we get these people on board? How does he establish legitimacy? I think much of that is going to require elite acceptance and elite statements. And one of the points in the inaugural address that I found particularly telling Biden several times made a point about truth. At one point, reject the culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured. And several other places in the speech talked about the importance of truth. And at one point, very pointedly, turned to the members of Congress who were on the dais, looking around left and right, and followed that up with a comment about leaders having the responsibility to defend the truth and defeat the lies. And I think that actually will be an important part of going forward for elected officials to join with that. I thought it was very important and helpful. The speech repeatedly did mention unity. As Lewis said, he did call out explicitly white supremacy. And he called this out in the context of saying that the forces that divide us are not new, right? You know, nativism, racism, and so forth have been here before. But the key points that he ended with was, you know, to start afresh, you know, unity, decency. To those who don't support me, hear me out, take a measure, and if you still disagree, so be it. That's democracy. Anyhow, I think it was important that it was not a speech full of specifics apart from cataloging the challenges that we face. And so I want to end with an image after the speech that I found telling. My colleague, Professor Wattenberg, reminds me that this is normal, but since we're not in normal times, this bit of normalcy, I think, is crucially important. The outgoing vice president was escorted down the steps of the east steps of the Capitol by the incoming vice president, Pence and his wife, by Harris and her husband. But it wasn't pro forma and it wasn't perfunctory. They didn't just walk down the steps. They stopped halfway down and had what was visibly a very, very cordial conversation, complete with laughter and smiling. Now, in normal times, you'd say, yeah, of course. In our times, it's, I think, very important that that's an image that is there on the departure of Vice President Pence, who was the only representative of given the absence of the president, the vice president was a very important representative. So thank you very much for the time and for letting me take part this morning.
Thank you, Carole. That's fascinating. I want to remind the audience that as questions come to you, please do feel free to enter them into the question and answer chat on your ribbon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're followed now by Professor Marty Wattenberg.
Well, thanks, Graeme. Happy to be with everybody today. And I thought I'd share one family story, which was my mom recounting attending the 1933 inaugural of Franklin Roosevelt, his first inaugural. And I thought about that in part because we're in a time of crisis, and I, reviewed the speech. And just quickly to tell you what things were like in those days, she said at 11 o'clock, an hour before the inaugural speech, her father said, "Let's get in the car. We're going to go up Capitol Hill and see this." And they parked as close as they could get to the hill, which was not that far away. Went to the back of the crowd, and they saw the president being sworn in and so forth. This was in the East Front, so their back is to the Library of Congress, and whereas today's ceremony, all the ceremonies since Reagan's in 1981 faced west. Prior to that, they would face east towards the Supreme Court and Library of Congress. And my mom said, after that, I felt so much better, that things were going to get better, and it was so inspiring. And that was a challenge that Biden had today. I'm not sure how well he reached it. So with that, let me start with a share screen if I can. And I often like to illustrate points with cartoons. So I assume everybody can see this, right, Graeme? Graeme? Good? Okay. And so we've already made some reference to this. We got a lot of things going on. I saw this cartoon after the George Floyd protests, like, didn't you always wonder what it would be like to experience the American Civil War, the riots, now riots, different, and the Great Depression, the flu epidemic of 1918, the rise of fascism in the 30s, all at once. And so Biden comes in a really, really tough situation. And his speech, is pretty much what I expected, which was generalities. He didn't declare a state of emergency and ask for emergency powers like Roosevelt did, probably because he knows he doesn't have support for that. Here's a piece of data. I always like to bring data with me. I got the idea from Elvin Lim's book, The Anti-Intellectual Presidency. And it graphs the readability scores of inaugural speeches going all the way back to George Washington. And you can see the trend over a long period of American history is, I like to think of it as democratization, is making these speeches readable for the ordinary person. And you can see I put in some very historic presidents who took the oath at a time of real crisis. Jefferson, in a real crisis of our democracy in 1801, was, his speech was easier to read than most in his time. Lincoln was much more readable than most in his time in 1861. And Franklin Roosevelt in 1945, which my mom also saw, where she just walked into the White House about a half hour before the ceremony started. And it was a very, very brief ceremony. And the big thing she said about that was Roosevelt looked terrible, which is probably why it was so short, because he was really on the verge of dying. And then since the TV era started, these speeches have been very, very easy to read because they've been conversational. And the easiest one ever is George H.W. Bush in 1989, who took office in a sort of similar situation. Maybe we can talk about this in question and answer about, there's not a lot of support for this guy, for this new president in Congress. He's in a very perilous situation in terms of congressional support. Biden's is another one that's above 70. And so 70 to 80, if you look down to the scale, is fairly easy to read. Whereas 60 to 70, even lower, lower score, is plain English, easily understood by my daughter, who's 14. So this speech, it really appealed to everybody. And if you take the grade level, here's another graph. Biden's speech was pitched at the 6th grade level. Prior to Coolidge, I believe, in 25, all presidents had pretty much their speeches were put at college level. So we really dumb things down, for better or for worse. And you can call that the anti-intellectual presidency, or you can call it the a presidency that speaks to the common person. And I think that's a matter of judgment. So then I just wanted to comment on what's a problem that Lewis mentioned, is who was watching? And were Republicans watching? And so what we've seen with TV ratings, and we'll see tomorrow what the TV ratings were for this. Now, it may be that the TV ratings will actually be somewhat higher because more people are at home without that much to do. And also that the whole thing is shorter because of the lack of a parade, et cetera. But you can see what's going on is usually when there's a change in party control, which is on the left, like Nixon 69 or Trump 17 or Biden this year, that the ratings are higher. If there's continuity in party control, such as a second term, you see lower ratings. And then the share, they haven't reported since 2005. A rating tells you what percentage of households are tuned in at the time. The share tells you what percentage of TVs that are on, according to the Nielsen measurement, are tuned into the inauguration. And you can see that what's happened over time is the three networks dominated things in the Nixon era, and early in the Carter era, and early in the Reagan era. And since cable TV, there's other things to watch. And so the share for Bush 05 is only 37%. 63% of people who were watching something else. And only 12% of the whole public watched the inaugural at any point in time. They do measurements every minute, and then they average it out. So what I'm worried about is a lot of Republicans, and we've seen this a lot in the data in recent years, and certainly in 2020, there's some really good examples, is Democrats are watching different things than Republicans. And it's like the Democratic convention, Republicans weren't watching, and the Republican convention, Democrats weren't watching. And so it's a Democratic inauguration. I wonder if Republicans were watching. So he didn't reach out to Republicans very much. He just called for unity. And it may be Republicans weren't watching. I have good reason to suspect so. Final thing is to pick up a cartoon that I used 4 years ago at an event we had. I worried a lot about that at 4 years ago, especially after I heard the American Carnage speech. And it's a great quote from Abraham Lincoln. If you want to test a man's character, give him power. And it's like, oh my gosh, you've given Trump the ultimate power. Does he have the character? Well, we can all make our own conclusions on that, but there's reason to think that Trump's character didn't match the moment, at least certainly in my view. And then, as there was some reference to that Carole particularly talked about, that Trump wasn't at the inaugural, which is just a terribly sad thing, that this tradition goes way, way back. And, when my mom saw FDR, she also saw Hoover. And FDR and Hoover did not get along. They never spoke again after the inaugural. And they say that the ride up to Capitol Hill was, it was silence. They didn't talk, but they rode together. Well, 1861, this is Buchanan, arguably the worst president of the 19th century, and maybe the worst president ever. And he was pro-slavery, and he was not that happy with Lincoln winning, and he did nothing to deal with the states that had already withdrawn from the Union. Yet he took his carriage down from the White House, picked up Abraham Lincoln at the Willard Hotel 2 blocks down. They went to the Hill together. And this is Harper's Weekly did this drawing of Lincoln entering the Senate chamber with Buchanan before the inaugural. They were there together. And it is just an absolute shame on our democracy and our transitions that our current president, or our former president, did not go, did not acknowledge the peaceful transition of power here, and did not acknowledge the legitimacy of this election. And it's going to be hard to recover from this. So with that, happy to talk as we go along about the Biden presidency and what's coming. Of course, that will be speculative. So I'll turn the floor back over to Graeme. Thanks.
Thank you, Marty, and to all of our panelists. Again, to those of the audience, please do raise questions both about the inauguration we watched this morning, but also for our reflections on the accomplishments of the prior administration and the opportunities and challenges for the new administration. One of the things that came up, across your talks was this role of the inauguration in setting the agenda, in recalling the symbolic and actual importance of American democracy. And I wonder if you would be willing, any of you, to reflect on comparisons from 4 years prior. President Trump gave a famous speech, now called the American Carnage speech, in the inauguration, where he actually talks about many of the same themes of inequality, unemployment, opportunity, from a very different perspective from Trump. If we move forward, we know that American presidents have given inaugurations in a moment of crisis. Ronald Reagan, facing west, also had the hostages released right on inauguration day. So, you know, if you can remark on how Biden's opportunity to speak in front of the country as this new president compares both to Trump and maybe to other remarkable inaugurations past.
We're all being respectful of each other.
Right.
Carole, would you like to lead? I'm happy to.
No, Louis, it's yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, you know, it is, I think Marty's cartoon was very evocative. Presidents have certainly faced challenges before, but they've often been focused on aspects of the society, certainly the economy. When Marty's mom was able to attend Franklin Roosevelt's first inauguration, the nation dividing when Presidents Lincoln and Buchanan attended together. President Biden brings together a unique confluence and an unfortunate confluence of national tragedies, an economic tragedy coming out of a public health tragedy, but a fundamental challenge to the democracy that, you know, is evocative of the Lincoln era, and an incredibly divided nation and Congress. I mean, and we've had 50-50 Senates before, certainly, but when we had a 50-50 Senate, we didn't have a House that was also so equally divided. You know, if you look at the states in terms of, you know, unified control in the states, you have states that are very much divided. So I don't want to, I mean, I'm running the risk here of presentism, you know, seeing the present as so unique, but you know, for our audience, I think it is important to see all of these factors coming together present a very unique set of challenges for an administration that didn't have as much time to prepare, perhaps, as many previous administrations have. You know, the control of the Senate is decided today with the swearing in of the newest members, including our newest member from California, replacing Vice President Harris. You know, so these are unique times. Unique times provide opportunities for presidents, and few people are probably better suited than a man who has, as President Trump loved to point out, you know, 40 years of history in Washington. But you know, the future of the country quite fundamentally rests on his success, and the willingness of a large part of the Congress, let alone a large part of the society, is a little bit more suspect than it has been in past eras. Maybe the exception of the pre-Civil War era, but you know, certainly throughout the 20th century, there was a functional bipartisanship in Congress that is absent today. So you know, President Biden has wanted this office for many years. He's run a couple of times before. He didn't get the country at the best moment, but that provides, I think, the best opportunity. I guess, you know, none of us have commented, but it's worth making the statement that Vice President Harris is unique on any number of dimensions, and you know, she's a woman. That's a first. She is an African American. That's a first. She is Asian American with ancestry in India. That is a first. Her husband is Jewish. That is a first. You know, so as challenging as this moment is, we shouldn't overlook the historical moment. And in Vice President Harris, we have many historical moments.
I just want to add a brief comment in terms of President Biden's experience. Immediately after the luncheon, sometime before the rest of the ceremony continued, he signed at least 17, I heard, executive orders executive orders and nominations. So he got down to work immediately, right, once he had the office. And I think given the number of challenges the country faces, we are actually fortunate to have somebody who has decades of experience. Hopefully it's used well, but I find it promising that he's moving as quickly as he is and with as much decisiveness as he is. How the moment compares. I go back to John F. Kennedy's inaugural address that had rhetoric that people still quote, right? When I teach my writing class, I play the inaugural address. I don't think Biden's address today had the kind of ringing poetry. It wasn't, it was more than serviceable. It was, but I don't think it had a line that's going to live on like, ask not what your country can do for you. I will say that the poet, on the other hand, had a really astonishingly moving statement. The other thing in this inauguration that I found striking was the variety. There was diversity represented on the stage with the people who were singing, presenting invocations, presenting poetry. And that recent presidents have tried to do that as well, at least on part of the aisle. Right. That's, Graeme, I don't have more to add to your question at the moment.
If I could first answer or address Heidi Hart's question that's in the Q&A, is like, what role did the outgoing presidents ever do, in a formal role? Never a speech, to my knowledge, but just being there is symbolic. And being one of the very first people to congratulate the new president after they take the oath of office is traditional. And it's also traditional for the new president to thank the outgoing president for their service, even if they didn't agree with them on a lot of things. It's traditional. And so it's really a problem for the legitimacy of our system to not have the outgoing president there playing that symbolic role, which dates back to Martin Van Buren being at William Henry Harrison's inaugural. And that Van Buren was the outgoing president and he was defeated by Harrison. And the fact that Van Buren is really the founder of our two-party system, who said we have to acknowledge the legitimacy of an opposition party, and that changed the nature of American democracy, and that's what I worry about. On my other screen, I have the New York Times. I was looking for information, and Carole cited executive orders. It's like, okay, he didn't mention policy specifics, Biden didn't, but he signed 17 executive orders, many of which I think are controversial, which change government policy, which are not about unity at all, and Republicans will not like when they see it. Also on my screen, I see Thomas Edsel's column, Is America Ungovernable Now? And that is something that really worries me. As Lewis said, we've just not had an incoming president with such a divided Congress. And, we still have filibuster in the Senate. And even if you get 50 votes and Vice President Harris, you could still have a lot of things blocked, even if they have majority support. So I'm very worried as to what can be done and can we have an effective government here. And obviously Joe Biden, he is taking the approaches we're going to try for as much bipartisanship. But let me go back to the simplest inaugural address, which was George H.W. Bush's 1989. And he came in under the worst circumstances in terms of party support in Congress. And he said, let me reach out my hand to you, Mr. Speaker, Speaker of the other party. And let me reach out my hand to you, Mr. Majority Leader, the Democratic Majority Leader, and people that he knew that he had to work with. Well, I can't help but think that about how 3.5 years later, the Republican convention he retold that. I was like, I reached out my hand to them. And you know what they did? They bit it off. Very bitter statement that George H.W. Bush, not a very bitter person usually, but he was very bitter about the whole experience and the lack of ability of him to govern on domestic policy. And we could afford that in the 1989 to 1993 period. I just don't know that we can afford that kind of gridlock right now. And that's what I really worry about, and whether Biden will push the envelope to get things through with the minimal support, which is honestly what I think he needs to do. But that's a strategic decision that people will disagree with for sure. Okay, thanks, Graeme.
Marty just managed to touch on the full arc of my questions for the next 15 or 20 minutes. So it's as did Heidi. So it's hard to figure out exactly where I'm going to pick off. But Marty, I'm going to do something I know you don't love to do, since you rarely like to involve yourself in forecasting or prognostication or future looking. But you've done it. You've opened up the door by talking about, you know, this question of whether Biden can accomplish his very ambitious policy agenda. As Carole remarked, even prior to today's inauguration, you know, Biden was preparing executive orders, unilateral actions to overturn prior decisions from President Trump and to advance his own policy goals. These themselves are sweeping. They involve immigration reform. They involve recommitments to the Paris Climate Accord. It involves student loan relief. So there's much that he can accomplish through unilateral action, right? There's also much that Biden can accomplish through budget reconciliation, vis-a-vis his pandemic response insofar as it touches on budgeting. And yet he faces a challenge, I think, that we can all recognize, which is we have a divided country. We'll talk in a second about the need to restore trust in our government, whether the Biden administration can do what many more left-leaning pundits are saying, which is demonstrate that government matters again. And yet, much of what he is going to accomplish cannot be accomplished with the current filibuster. Democracy reform, massive environmental regulation, policies ambitious that are needed to satisfy the broad and diverse Democratic coalition on inequality and racial justice, right? And there is a real tension in the Obama administration between the lessons of the Obama administration, where many people thought that Obama gave too much in an effort to be bipartisan in response to the crisis, even though he possessed a unified Democratic majority, a larger one than Biden, versus the lessons of that very Obama administration, that trying to be bipartisan is an error in your early time in office. So, you know, I'll put it to you, given the tools available to the Biden administration, executive unilateral action, compromise with the Democratic caucus through budget reconciliation, and the more ambitious agenda, how should Biden proceed? What are the challenges facing a Biden administration, both in holding together its Democratic caucus and advancing a policy agenda as ambitious as the one he's described? So you guys, that's a broad question. It really amounts to what can Biden do? What would you expect him to do in cooperation with Congress and through unilateral presidential action? And you can flip the question back on me if need be, but I will defer until a few of you had a chance to answer that. So the question is, what can Biden do to satisfy this agenda? Marty.
I think you can't create new programs through a budget bill. So you're stuck with that. And you have this problem where every senator on the Democratic side can hold the budget hostage and say, well, it's quite possible that you're not going to get a single Republican vote for a big budget reconciliation bill. And so that means, anybody can say you can't go beyond this level. So, we mentioned Obama's stimulus plan, which, Obama's the first to say it could have been bigger in 2009, but this is the most I could realistically get. And that is going to reduce our effectiveness. And it's just a fact of life. I think that they have to do this quickly, and they have to give the Republicans a very short time frame to say, what can we work together with? And if the answer is nothing, then just go to either carving out filibuster exceptions. So Graeme mentioned voting reform, which is, my pet bill, which is going to be Senate Bill number 1, given, really special status. And do not let the Republicans filibuster that. You just say you can't filibuster a voting reform bill and see if you can get unanimous support. But, the House situation is also very difficult. There's not that many votes to spare. And I just afraid that really limits things. And, if they can come up with some Republican support, if McConnell were willing to work with Biden, which I think Biden thinks is possible, then they could accomplish a lot more. But, it's anybody's guess right now until you see what McConnell says. Good.
Adding on to what Marty said, I think, I agree with everything he just said, but on top of that, I think public opinion actually will matter quite a bit. Members of Congress are looking to get reelected, and I think, and obviously pay attention to what the electorate's doing. And from that point of view, a number of people have been saying, it sounds plausible to me, that if the Biden administration does manage to get COVID better under control, manages to get 100 million vaccinations in the first 100 days, manages to do something dramatic to, if they are able to do that, I think that might have an effect on public opinion. But the other part of public opinion is what's going on with the purveyors of information on the media, and we'll see what happens there. But that's something that could shift things in their favor a little bit in their favor in terms of increasing the payoff for bipartisan cooperation. Marty, you look skeptical, so.
Yeah, I was just skeptical that all that's possible. And, I think the expectations for Biden right now are way too high, just like they were for Obama, and things will be slow to improve.
I generally share my colleagues' pessimism going forward, with maybe one carve out called infrastructure, around which there can be remarkable bipartisan support when it brings jobs into districts. And infrastructure, I think, can be redefined for the COVID era a little bit more broadly than it has been in the past, to include sort of rebuilding a public health system. So around that, I guess I'm a little more optimistic about some potential for bipartisanship, at least in the short term. The one branch of government of our federal government that is not particularly divided by partisanship is the Supreme Court, which now has a very solid conservative majority, even on those times when Chief Justice Roberts chooses to vote with the liberals. And that presents a real problem for governance through executive order. Certainly each of the last 2 presidents, to a large degree, and to a lesser degree going back, have sort of been beguiled by the power of the executive order, and then have found some limits in it. I fully suspect that the Biden lawyers are more competent than the Trump lawyers, Michael Cohen accepted, of course, in that I suspect the 17 orders that are written today, don't have typos in them, and are at least sort of have a prima facie constitutionality, which some of the Trump executive orders did not. But that doesn't mean that when they get to the Supreme Court will acknowledge the president's power in these areas. So we are certainly in a rocky moment, but we've been, here I'll echo President Biden, we've been in rocky moments before and we found ways to overcome them. So I think we have to be, even as pessimists, look for some areas for shared opportunities, and maybe we can build from infrastructure.
To add my perspective, since you brought up things that I personally think about a lot in my research, the first is that I share my colleague's skepticism that the Democrats can actually adopt widespread filibuster reform in a way needed to get an ambitious New Deal style policy agenda enacted through the legislative branch. We focus a lot on Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who basically is the deciding vote on whether the Democrats will go to filibuster and has announced that he will not support filibuster reform at this point, although perhaps he can be induced to do so. But as Californians, I'd be remiss not to point out that our own senior senator, Dianne Feinstein, has recently shown an appetite for the more deliberative Senate of the past and a reluctance herself to become a more partisan senator. And again, we can make of that what we will. So given a president who is going to be dealing with a Congress that's unlikely to pass his policy agenda, we have to ask what Biden is likely to do given the precedents of the past. And the first lesson of the Obama administration is that I would expect that to the extent that they pass laws, they're going to be looking to defer the details to the bureaucracy. The Affordable Care Act, they passed quickly with the expectation that they would lose unified government within a few short years, but that the Biden administration would remain. So what you do is you pass broad bills and then allow the bureaucracy to spell out the details moving forward through executive action. The other really important lesson, and it's just, I would expect that we're going to see a lot of Republicans complaining again about unilateral imperial presidential action. That happened when Bush was president, W. It happened under Obama. We've had rising concern about unilateral presidential power. The causes of that, though, may not be as nefarious as they may just be the causes of necessity. When we have inertia in the legislative branches, problems don't go away. Right? Problems need to be resolved by administrations. And yet in a period of polarization and declining bipartisanship, these problems can't be easily solved through legislative action. And presidents are on a short time horizon. So, through some of my research, what we find is in these periods of divided government, we can expect executive action to increase, especially in periods like this, where because the Democrats have narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate, Republican oversight, the ability of the Republican majorities to rein in executive action is diminished. Democrats can't quite pass the laws through the legislature, but they can protect those actions, at least through legislative deference, when Obama does them through unilateral executive order. This leads to the final point that Lewis just brought up, which is there is a massive, under-discussed percolating battle in the courts over the non-delegation doctrine, over whether the federal government, the bureaucracy, really can effectively enact law without the explicit consent of Congress. And many of these most conservative members of the court take a hostile view of the expansive powers given to a delegated federal bureaucracy. We talk more about social issues, about abortion and gay marriage, but a radical decision in non-delegation that reins in the power of a federal bureaucracy could be more disruptive to the status quo in American politics than any of the decisions we talk about more popularly in the press. So something to keep an eye on is how Biden's efforts to advance his agenda independent of Congress triggers battles both within partisan politics, but also between the judiciary and presidential politics. I would expect that to become a dominant theme over the next 8 years, in fact. One of the questions that Heidi raised, and I'll go ahead and share a screen for those of us who are, I guess, I don't even know what to say, old, young, at this point. I can't share. Oh, well, I'm somehow moderator, but not sharing. That's all right. Is the power of ex-presidents. Saturday Night Live used to have a wonderful cartoon called The Ex-Presidents, where they would imagine Bush and Clinton and Bush Sr. and Ford, or whatever president was still alive, becoming superheroes. And the ex-president has a role. It's a role that we don't talk a lot about in our research. And so I'm asking you guys, what are the guardrails on ex-presidents? What are the expected norms of deference of ex-presidents? And what are the ways that a President Trump could continue to project power? And what are the ways that the system could restrain a president who's no longer in power, but certainly has the opportunity to influence an absolutely animated base of actors?
With
Well,
regard,
quickly, one of the things I'm worried about, Trump has the biggest, nest egg of funds to make trouble than any president ever had, which is that he has a political action committee which has like $250 million that he can use at his discretion for political spending. So the good news about Trump is that he doesn't have a Twitter account anymore, so he can't just broadcast his little thoughts. And I remember at the previous event, Jeff Kopstein said, well, if they just take away his Twitter account, that will, silence him. And I said, he's still president of the United States. He can make a speech anytime, people will cover him, but he doesn't like to give speeches, apparently. He didn't want to go to the press room and say much, but, there's reason to be concerned. He can pay for these rallies. Maybe he can get a lot of people to show up. I think that they really have to proceed with this impeachment trial and to disqualify him from running for federal office ever again. That's one of the provisions of impeachment. And that's the major benefit of going ahead with the trial. I know it's going to be just a big distraction, but I think it could be done. Really, the evidence is clear, and either McConnell and people he can draw with him are going to vote for it or they're not. And they should get it done next week. So.
I would add that the president floating the idea of starting a breakaway conservative party called the American Patriot Party may not help him in his efforts to resist impeachment in a Senate where Republican votes are key for that.
Yeah, I'd like to add that there clearly are some senators who would be very happy if Trump were out of the picture with regard to 2024. It takes 2/3 vote to convict in the Senate on an impeachment charge, but it only takes a majority vote to bar a convicted official from running again. So McConnell would only have to wrangle 16 additional people to convict, and then the Democrats on their own could bar him from running again. Also want to underscore Marty's point about this money that Trump has raised. Something like 2/3 of it has gone to a leadership PAC that has very, very loose rules on disbursements, meaning that he could, in effect, use a lot of, like 2/3 of the money for personal expenses to pay for with just a tiny veneer, right? So it depends upon how, there's at least some people who think that he's more interested in enriching himself than making trouble. We can hope, right? We could hope. Graeme, in terms of your more general question, I think the point is that Trump as ex-president is in many ways a special case. Biden in his address today made a big point of, as most of them do in an inaugural address, of recognizing his predecessors who were on the dais and of how they came from both parties and warmly greeting them. And I think we have one ex-president who's we don't know what's going to happen, and others who seem to have been taking a very responsible elder statesman role, including in particular, I'd like to say, George W. Bush has been doing that. But this kitty this huge kitty that Trump has assembled, this $250 million is definitely a worry. So.
I think the Republicans should also be worried about that kitty, in that President Trump has always put personal grievance over party, and will certainly use some of those resources, to the extent that they're not for self-enrichment, to challenge Republicans who he feels were not sufficiently loyal to him. And that will be interesting to follow in the 2022 and 2024 elections. I think one norm that has characterized ex-presidents in the modern era, continued national security briefings, is one that has to stop immediately for President Trump, or not start for President Trump. It's not altogether clear that he paid that much attention to his national security briefings as president, and could certainly use those national security briefings as ex-president for personal or familial gain. And I would have said this before the attack on the Capitol 2 weeks ago, but leading an insurrection makes you ineligible to be part of the national security elite.
Well, to that question, and perhaps a final big question for discussion before I ask you for your thoughts, so that you can start thinking, guys, reasons for optimism and concern on this moment of inauguration. The final question I personally have has to deal with this question we were just discussing of accountability. It's a debate that's in the public sphere, but also one that has concerned academics for quite some time, which is, if you read a popular treatment of the erosion of democracies, How Democracies Die by Levitsky, one of the things that concerns them is a paradox that Biden finds himself in, which is how do you hold accountable a prior administration for the erosion of democratic norms or outright corruption or law breaking, without violating the equally important democratic tradition of not persecuting your political rivals? And how do you thread this needle without, taking an already incendiary, polarized America and exacerbating the problem? This shows up in our discussion comments for today's discussion, where some of the public rightly want to know, how we can know that Biden is not going to encourage the Democrats to take illegitimate action towards the outgoing president to seek redress. And then Democrats who rightly are asking how we can hold the Trump administration accountable for things that may have been done in order to restore the democratic norms we need. So Biden finds himself in a very precarious situation. And Marty, you've referred to character. Biden as a man trends towards bipartisanship, trends towards empathy, trends towards moving forward. How would you guys advise him, or how would you anticipate that the Biden administration is going to handle this very difficult question of the potential malfeasance of the Trump administration? How can a Biden administration put to rest broad claims of voter fraud that are amplified even now by large portion of the minority party, without itself becoming illegitimate, without being seen as an illegitimate actor? How do you do this? What does the literature show us? What do we make of that challenge?
On voter fraud, the bill called For the People Act, if you separate out the campaign finance reform from the voting reform, the campaign finance reform is going to have zero support among Republicans. But if you do the voting reform, clear guidelines for all the states on absentee ballots, and let's nationalize our system. And so a lot of the criticisms that came up in this election, from the Republican side and charges of fraud were really about differences between the states. And there's a bill that's there that's ready, that is my top priority, which was solve all of these problems. So I would urge Biden to really be focusing on that pretty soon. But as for the malfeasance, I think he wants to keep hands off of that. Let's let the Congress deal with this impeachment trial. Let's let the Attorney General and district attorneys deal with this. But I tell you, it hasn't been picked up on the news about the pardons. One of the things that concerned me when I looked on the list was Randy Cunningham, former congressman from San Diego. You remember him, Carole? He took so much money under the table. He had, he used his campaign finance account as his own personal spending account. And it's just another example of Trump saying, okay, political crimes don't count. Even though they were clearly financial crimes. And that these things have to be addressed, and where this crime committed. And Biden will take a hands off. So the Attorney General is not his lawyer, is America's lawyer. So let him pursue that.
Even better is the extent to which states can come after the Trump organization with regard to tax issues.
Sure.
I think that political, that's the kind of case, if shown, I think doesn't carry the same kind of political freight. And if it's done by the states, I think that it's having the federal government do this, having the Biden administration do this does raise problems. But I think there's enough out there from what we hear in the popular press. There's probably enough out there to enforce some accountability if it's just the states dealing with tax issues.
Having watched the Republican attorneys generals join the lawsuit to overturn the results of the election, I may hold a dimmer view of state action against incumbent or former presidents in a polarized federal system. Polarization in the context of federalism can be a defense against tyranny. It can also lead to decay. So I think it's a question, Carole, you and I will have to discuss.
Right. Well, there is New York, Graeme. So it's not all states, right? But there is New York, which is where much of the business has taken place. So,
and the District of Columbia, which to some degree has an independent judicial system from the federal government. As we've talked about reforms going forward, I want to put DC statehood and should they want it, Puerto Rican statehood high on the agenda. Were these to be carved out of filibuster, and I have no idea how Joe Manchin feels about it. You know, it's a small d democratic value, but one where you're unlikely to have an immediate challenge of reciprocity from the Republicans because we don't have a lot of other territories. I guess you could make some arguments about the Virgin Islands and Guam, but I don't think they have moved anywhere near to the sort of steps to statehood that Puerto Rico, again, if the people of Puerto Rico want it, but certainly the District of Columbia, bringing together our shared histories here.
right. Well, and also with the District of Columbia, the experience on January 6th with the difficulty calling out the National Guard provides the kind of easily publicly understandable argument that I think the previous calls for DC statehood haven't had. I failed to echo Marty's call for voter reform. I agree that that would be something very, very high on the list, the whole set of things there. And I think I would add to that, it would not, I think it would be advantageous politically and not costly to say, people have concerns about legitimacy of the 2020 election. We can have a commission, right, that can then once again review the evidence and conclude that there were no problems. But I don't think it would be, I think it might be a reasonable move to set up such a blue ribbon panel as well.
I have to respectfully disagree with my colleague here. I think that would just inflame President Trump and give him the "I told you so" moment that he's so desperately been looking for. I would trust is it 65 out of 66? I hear different numbers. Federal court rulings that found that claims of malfeasance in this election were unfounded.
I won't respectfully agree or disagree, but I will share my skepticism that the Trump administration itself had a commission that reviewed the incidents of electoral fraud and very quietly determined it wasn't really a problem. Right. And that didn't seem to bend the arc much. It just led to new charges of even more expansive and dramatic cases. So
I would refer you.
Okay, I withdraw my comment.
I would refer you all to our colleague Peter Navarro's magisterial scholarly review of the election that found the horror of the outcome that merits condemnation from us.
Earlier today, wait, Graeme, I must add on Peter Navarro. Earlier today, as I was getting ready for this, apparently China has sanctioned Pompeo and 28 other officials, including Peter Navarro, barring them from ever coming to China, Hong Kong, or Macau. So there you go.
Let's hope that
our former colleague cannot go.
Yeah. So a final question, and we move off. 4 years ago, many political scientists were newly concerned, seeing and now over the past years witnessing things in the American sphere that were unusual or new to Americanists, but familiar to those who studied democracies and democratic decay in other countries. And one of the popular things to do was to publish lists, what to watch for over 4 years of a Trump administration, to let us know when we were crossing red lines or when alarm bells needed to be sounded. So either for reasons of optimism or concern, I would ask each of you, what's something to watch for in the Biden administration that might be telling to you in your area of research about the future of American democracy? What's something we can watch for that you're monitoring or of interest to you, Marty, since you cocked your head, in any way, shape, or form?
Can we deal with the, tightly controlled, tightly or very closely divided House and Senate? And especially, can we deal with Senate filibusters in some effective way? And, can we have an effective government is what concerns me. And we can do it in foreign policy, not talk about foreign policy much, but I think, competent, respected foreign policy is back. And so, we can be optimistic about that, but, we have a lot of domestic problems, and I'm just very worried about whether anything much will be accomplished by the federal government to deal with it. And we'll see.
I guess Graeme, you want us searching for points of optimism. So I guess one point of optimism is coming out of the field I look at, which is political participation, is the engagement of large swaths of the American public in politics over the last 4 years. Now, the ones who stormed the Capitol are engaged in a way that we have condemned, but I think the point is that there are many millions of Americans who have become engaged in ways that are positive. And hopefully if we can couple that with doing something about misinformation and shared facts going forward, we'll be much better off. So.
Yeah, I certainly share Carole's optimism based on participation. And, the election, the November election was dramatic. The Georgia runoff was astounding, sort of lost in the insurrection, but 92% of people, the turnout in the runoff, which is usually a very low turnout event, was almost, close to the turnout in the general election. And that is just remarkable. And it was it was a more
for Georgia in the first place.
Excuse me?
It was already large, yeah.
Yeah, over a very high base. So yeah, and it turned out lots of young people, still fewer than older people, turned out a more diverse electorate. The Georgia is not by any means a blue state, but it showed that there's a power in long-term mobilization across different racial and ethnic communities, across different sort of economic interests in the state. And that is positive. I guess if I'm looking for sort of a point of concern, certainly the insurrection is a model of a new form or a renewed form of direct confrontational violent challenges to democratic institutions. And as Graeme has pointed out, we saw this at the state level long before we saw it at the federal level, and we overlooked or we neglected it. The challenge, there are many challenges there, but that mainstream leaders, that leaders from the swamp, if you will, were encouraging, egging on, protecting, creating space for those sorts of movements is a very dangerous step in any advanced democracy. And where people's passions are going to be high for a long time, damping down that encouragement from elites is very, very important. And I think President Biden's speech today was an important first step. There will need to be many, many, many more.
Well, January 6th is a day that's going to last with me for a long time for reasons that my colleagues have mentioned. But in the morning before the Capitol insurrection, it was announced that Georgia had elected an African-American and Jewish American senator, half a century after an African-American and Jewish freedom rider had been assassinated in the South organizing for civil rights, leading later in the afternoon to an insurrection where the Confederate flag was walked through the hallways. Let's hope that the inauguration is what Biden calls for, which is for that moment of unity where we can think seriously about these democratic challenges that are facing us and find a path institutionally, structurally, to move forward. It won't be easy, and I will take this opportunity to announce a talk that we're going to have next Friday at noon with Professor Peter Ditto, who is co-author of an article in Science Magazine on political sectarianism in America, an idea that traditional concepts of polarization are no longer adequate to capture the growing ideological, cultural, tribal divisions that are infecting the body politic in the United States. So all of you who are on this list will get that announcement, but I'll conclude now by simply saying thank you to my panelists. Thank you, Lewis, to the Department of Political Science, to Akua, to Andy Hill and Chris Davis in the School of Social Science for your help. We couldn't do it without you. And most importantly, thank you to all of you for showing up and participating in this conversation and listening and reflecting on this day of inauguration. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.